This is Talking Drupal, a weekly chat about web design and development from a group of people with one thing in common. We love Drupal. This is episode 507, International Drupal Federation. On today's show, we're talking about the International Drupal Federation initiative, why it's important now, and how it will shape the future of Drupal, with our guest, Tim Doyle. We'll also cover Modeler API as our module of the week. Welcome to Talking Drupal. Today, our guest is Tim Doyle. Tim is currently serving as the CEO of the Drupal Association. He has 25 years of experience in the nonprofit and government sectors. And in the past, he's worked for a public sector startup that built an IT system serving 65 U.S. state agencies. Tim, welcome back to the show, and thanks for joining us.
Thank you. It's great to be here. It's my third time. I'm feeling like a little bit like a celebrity.
Yeah, you're don't worry. This is about the time where you hit like pro status. You're kind of like, you get real used to it. Folks, I'm John Picozzi, solutions architect at EPAM, and today joining me for the fourth time, Norah Medlin, director of delivery and program operations at Bluefly.io. Norah also is a lead organizer at MidCamp, and as we said, director of delivery and program operations at Bluefly.io. Norah brings her technical program and process improvement expertise as a certified SAFe, Agilist, and CSSGB professional. Norah, welcome to the show, and thanks for joining us for the last 4 weeks.
Thank you so much for having me. It's good to have you here, Tim.
And last, but certainly not least, Nic Laflin, founder at Enlightened Development. What's going on, Nic?
Not too much. Happy to be here.
Fabulous. And now, to talk about our module of the week, let's turn it over to Martin Anderson-Clutz, a senior solutions engineer at Acquia and a maintainer of a number of Drupal modules and recipes of his own. Martin, what do you have for us this week?
Thanks, John. Have you ever wanted to use a common visual toolkit to define and represent a variety of business logic on your Drupal website, including responding to events, defining migrations, and building AI agents? There's a module for that. It's called Modeler API, and it was created in March of 2025 by Jürgen Haas, who listeners may know from his excellent work on ECA, Drupal CMS, and the Gin admin theme, as well as other popular Drupal projects. It has a 1.0.0 Alpha 3 version available, which supports Drupal 11.2 or newer, but I hear we might have a first beta release by the time this recording is public. It is actively maintained and has security coverage for documentation. There isn't a ton yet, but if the wealth of documentation available for ECA is any kind of indication, hopefully there will be more shortly. Now, it does have 11 open issues, none of which are bugs, and all but 3 of which have now been marked as fixed, and it is officially in use by 2 sites according to Drupal.org. Now, listeners may recall that we covered ECA as module of the week way back in episode 375 and as a show topic in 402. For me, one of the things that really stands out about ECA is the ability to implement workflows as visual diagrams. Earlier this year, discussions began about using that BPMN diagramming interface for other things, including defining migrations and the logic for AI agents. Part of the magic of Drupal community events like DrupalCon is the way they can catalyze important work by bringing together the people with the knowledge, skills, and expertise to move innovation forward. Jürgen, Benji Fischer, and Chris Weber used the Contribution Day at DrupalCon Atlanta to get this work started. Now we have not only the Modeler API, but also new versions of ECA, AI agents, and BPMN.io, so you can start using these new combinations already. In fact, a couple of weeks ago, Jürgen posted an update on LinkedIn. We'll have a link in the show notes, which includes a video showing the process of using the BPMN modeler to define an AI agent, as well as sub-agents that can independently handle smaller parts of the overall task. Finally, having a separate modeler API means that support for multiple UIs is possible. Many have seen and used the BPM interface that ECA is known for, but there is discussion about developing other modelers, potentially based on React or even Experience Builder, and drawing on popular solutions like N8N or Workato for inspiration. So let's talk about Modeler API.
Oh my gosh. I have so many questions right now. Okay. So, and I heard Nick take a breath. So Nick probably has questions too, or at least comments, but let me see if I understand what you're saying here, Martin, appropriately. So, and I'm going to use ECA as the kind of reference point here. When you install ECA, like, I don't know, let's say prior to this module existing, right? You would install ECA and then you install BPMN module as the modeler for ECA. And then you'd build your stuff in ECA using BPMN business logic to build to build your flows, right? So basically what this is doing is it's abstracting kind of the business logic library that you're using into an API. So that way you can kind of like plug and play the different diagramming, interfacing, business logic things with ECA and not have to kind of rewrite your stuff every time. Is that fair? Am I like close to right there?
Yeah, no, I think that that's a really good way to put it. So, as you say, there has always been the bpmn.io module that had some Drupal logic to it, but it was, the overall way that library was integrated into Drupal was sort of, very much written specifically for ECA. And so, as you say, this is really an abstraction layer that allows that drag and drop interface for defining business logic to be used with things other than ECA. Most notably, we already have that as a working example for AI agents, but there's talk about using it for the other example that I've seen is for migrations, but even thinking about ECA, the other integration that I've heard of that sounds pretty exciting, there's already some work started, is around having ECA integrated with the Salesforce suite module. And so the idea of being able to drag and drop to build out potentially complex Salesforce integrations, I think could be very exciting for the community.
All right.
I am personally very excited about the migrate integration. I mean, writing YAML files to manage migrations. I mean, the thing is with the UI, it's still going to be very complex. It's going to be very click heavy. It's going to be I mean, it's still going to be somewhat tedious. I mean, you're mapping individual fields to individual fields and transforming them. There's no way to get around that tedium. But moving that back into the UI makes it more accessible to site builders again. It kind of goes back to the days of like, well, feeds still exists, I guess, but it it goes back to like feeds. Like you can start to like map things. You can start doing Drupal things again in the UI, which while still having them backed by config entities and YAML, I think that is really powerful. Even if you just use this as kind of like web form it is in the standard use case. You use the interface to configure it, and then you use config to kind of export it and transport it. And so if you can start doing that with migrations and ECA and AI agent, that's really powerful. Beyond the ability, I think the true power outside of Drupal is the business logic piece, like the BPMNIO stuff. You know, business folks know how to use that. And if you empower them to make business logic changes in Drupal, that just is another plus for Drupal. But yeah, what were you gonna say, John?
I just wanted to add one thing, which is I think the other value of BPMN is that it's visual enough. I think that for a lot of use cases, even if the overall interface remains complex enough that it's not necessarily something that you would want to put into the hands of a business user, it's kind of self-documenting in the sense that it creates sort of a visual representation of the business logic that you can at least put in front of somebody and say, do we have this right in terms of the overall flow? And then they can give you feedback on that, as opposed to, like a tree diagram or whatever that you'd have from the older rules module would be kind of impenetrable for some of those same people. So I feel like it allows you to bridge that gap, significantly easier.
So what I was gonna say, I think those are all very good points, and I do agree, Martin, that the like bridging the gap for people that are using this business logic model and bringing that into Drupal and having it like that common language, right, to speak to them, like between developer and business person, is powerful. But I think overall, like one thing that ECA and BPMN and probably now this module as well will suffer from is like documentation, because like and I think it's getting better, and I know that people are working on it and it will get better, but I think like one of the things that was hard initially with ECA was like knowing what values to put in where, and like what the fields kind of meant to make it easier for people to use. So I think that's probably going to be an area where like, hey, we got to kind of pour some time and energy into documentation and naming of things, just to make sure that everything is like easier to understand for dum-dums like me.
So, a couple of points on that. I guess I would say number one, if you're talking specifically about documentation, actually, there is a ton of it for ACA, and including sort of a library of example models, which is really powerful. It does potentially require some digging through sometimes to find the exact thing that you need, but there is also a really great ECA channel in Drupal Slack where if there are specific things that you're trying to do and you can't quite get your head around how to do it, oftentimes you can get an answer pretty quickly in there. So if we could have those same kinds of resources for something like, Modeler API, and then, the some of the more specific pieces around using it for AI agents or, building migrations or whatever the case might be, then I feel like that would be amazing and a tremendous resource. The other thing that I guess I didn't mention in the introduction is that part of the work that Jurgen has been doing for the Modeler API is also bringing into the interface the actual form API, which I think opens up some interesting possibilities in terms of like leveraging the states API or potentially even doing things around, form alters as a way to potentially add more custom logic into the way you need certain pieces to work to
Hmm.
specifically meet your own business needs. So I think there's a lot of potential, like, even in terms of, as you say, being able to modify the description of certain things so that if you have a business user that needs to go in and edit those things, that you can have a kind of a more bespoke way of how that's described to make it easier for them to understand.
Yeah. I mean, I think overall, right, this is all very positive. So I appreciate you bringing it to us and to the listeners. And Martin, if folks wanted to connect or suggest a module of the week, how best could they do that?
We always love talking about interesting projects in the Talking Drupal channel of Drupal Slack, or folks can reach out to me directly as ManClue on all of the Drupal and social channels.
Perfect. Thanks a lot, Martin.
See you next week.
All right. Let's move into our primary topic, talking about the International Drupal Federation Initiative. I'm not gonna lie, that's a bit of a mouthful, but we're gonna try to get it all out there every time we say it. So, I mean, Tim, what's the elevator pitch or a high level overview of what the International Drupal Federation Initiative is?
Yeah. So, in short, it's an effort to look at how Drupal is governed through our existing not for profit now, the Drupal Association, and revision that on a more global scale so that the common shared resources that the current DA takes care of are the governance includes folks from all over the globe. And there's a greater sense of shared responsibility in managing these assets.
Tim, can you give like a little bit of an example of just some of the assets or some of the things you're talking about?
Sure. Yeah. So, yeah, I mean, our primary mission at the Drupal Association is to support the Drupal project and the Drupal community. And primarily through the project, we do that through Drupal.org. We're housing the servers that make Drupal free and available to anyone, anywhere in the world at no cost. So that's obviously our most important asset, if you will. And obviously, it takes technology, it takes staff time, it takes coordination with the project. Every time there's a release or new of Drupal, constant coordination with the project to best support the project. Then we have initiatives like Drupal CMS or most recently announced Drupal AI. And that takes support from staff time and resources and stuff. And so I kind of consider all that the shared resources that make up Drupal. And right now, that's housed at the Drupal Association, which is a U.S. based not for profit, although our mission is global.
And why why is that something that's being started now? It looks like it was created on May 20th of this year, of 2025. So why is
Yeah.
this starting now?
Yeah. So we were sitting around the office and had nothing to do. And it was a Friday afternoon. No, I'm kidding. That was not. Just kidding. Just kidding. Really, it's interesting. So it came out, the board has a retreat. The DA board has a retreat twice a year before DrupalCon North America and DrupalCon Europe. And in DrupalCon Atlanta this past March, we were looking at a number of issues of how to get some sustainability in our revenues and in long-term support for. And it was noted that like the European community is way ahead in terms of supporting open source. The European Union, even specific governments like Germany and Switzerland, are they're just farther ahead than certainly in the US, the rest of the globe, in terms of supporting open source, seeing open source as a part of a larger digital public infrastructure that is necessary to support. So we were looking at, okay, how do we position ourselves to because we're obviously Drupal's big in Europe. There's a lot of Drupal associations in Europe. How do we access some of that funding to do the work that we need to do to sustain Drupal? And that led to this idea that we should be looking at, either creating an organization in Europe or having a European presence to better position ourselves to receive funding from the EU. And then that led to kind of a more existential question, which is how do we really long term sustain ourselves unless we have a governance process that includes voices from all over the globe, formally into our governance process. Right now, our board is more than half our board is outside the US. We take our global mission very seriously, and we're trying to do as much as we can to live into that. But we're still a little bit restrained and by being a US not for profit, and there's no formal mechanism. So it kind of like the discussion started at how do we, help our funding to how do we have better governance, and it really led to the point now saying let's kind of potentially solve a number of problems at once by looking at getting out from under a nation-based not-for-profit structure and going through truly kind of creating an international not-for-profit.
Thank you for that. I think where my mind goes is, naturally being involved in community is the community aspect here. Maybe just to dig into a little bit about how you might think that this initiative will change Drupal Association's sort of involvement in the larger Drupal ecosystem. Where do you feel like that, this initiative will really shape the sort of changes that we're all, kind of going towards, especially with Drupal CMS and other products. But how does this add to that?
Yeah, so potentially this could be a big change. What we're looking at is, and the reason why it's a big long sentence of internet, Drupal International Federation Initiative Working Group, whatever. But a federation is, by definition, a not-for-profit that is made up of member not-for-profits or could be individuals, member groups that are therefore members of this international not-for-profit. So unlike the way we're structured today, where the board is appointed by the board members and it's two members of what they call 501c3 not-for-profit. So it's not-for-profit organized in the US for charitable purposes. We would actually, under this new model, potentially have member organizations, member local Drupal associations, like the Dutch Drupal Association or or a Drupal Association in the US or, in any continent, any country. They would actually be members. So I think the big change that this could bring into the ecosystem is this idea that local associations and nation associations, Drupal associations at the national level become really important and part of the formal governance. So think about rather the board going through the current process for identifying who the board members are. If we had 10 Drupal associations that were members of this international not-for-profit, they would decide who the board is. And so all of a sudden, the activities and the organization at the local level matter a lot more. And that's one of the considerations the board will have to look into, like, how robust, how strong are the local associations within countries to support this kind of international not-for-profit.
So it's the YMCA model then, right? Where there's like a governing international board, and then each nation has their own, and then kind of we probably don't go this granular, but maybe camps count for this. But then each region will kind of have its own group. So it's really just a way to help. It's a organizational thing. It's a structural thing to just give each sub organization more say, right?
That's a great analogy. I had not. I'm going to write that one down. I had not thought of the YMCA model, but yes, it is that model where if you know YMCA's are independently run and but then they're all part of the YMCA international brand. We looked at the Red Cross model. The same thing. Like the Red Crosses are individual in the nation. They decide what they respond to in the nation, but there's a governing group above it that has the forces the brand, if you will, and the standards, and then runs programs through those those nation-based or local not-for-profits. And that's going to be back to your question, Nora, about a change. A lot of the stuff that now that the DA does directly, we may end up doing through local associations. So our Drupal certified partner program could be run through local associations. Membership, maybe someone becomes a member of the local association and they're automatically a member of the international one. So that's the other big change, I think, is that this will likely, in my opinion, require a much greater partnership between local associations and the international not-for-profit, obviously, so that for our programs, to run effectively.
And just to expand on that just a little bit, the currently, it's my understanding that there are local Drupal associations in the European region, and that there's several of them, but I don't think that there's anywhere else. I mean, I know that there's not a local Drupal association here in the United States or North America, but there may be some others in other regions that I'm not aware of. So I do wonder the change in respect to that as well. Like, are we saying that we're this effort would also create like a sort of structure and programs around how other regions could form local associations?
Yes, I think it could provide a roadmap for how to form an association that can carry out programs and be effective and be kind of an ongoing entity. But I think you're 100% right. And one thing I want to acknowledge is that there are obviously Drupal communities all across the globe, and we've sponsored 2 years in a row now the Burkina Faso Drupal meetup. But there's also a great variety of what we mean. So some are formally organized. The Dutch Drupal Association is a legal not-for-profit in the Netherlands. But then some are just meetups and groups that are informally organized. Some have kind of structure on a website. Some don't even have that. The particular model that we're looking to incorporate under, which is a Belgium law, allows for a great variety of members. So it's pretty flexible. So we can incorporate you know, different membership levels depending on the organization that happens to be in effect in a certain area. So if you're a formal not for profit and you have a bank account and maybe even a paid staff or part time staff, that could be one kind of membership class. But if you're more volunteer based and there's no legal organization, then that might be separate. So it's flexible to have different folks come in at different levels. It doesn't have to be all one. You have to meet these strict requirements in order to be part of this governance.
Well,
So
for the smaller groups, I think that they might, have a breath of relief, it comes to that. Oh no, I have to become a nonprofit. Well, okay, that's not the case here. That's being taken into account. I appreciate.
exactly. That's this Belgian law that we're looking at to incorporate under. Just it provides a lot of flexibility, and that's one of the things the working group is going to be looking at is how to what's out there, and what are the different types of organizations that local Drupal communities have, and then how do we fit them into a structure that into a governance structure that works.
So I'm thinking of this and I'm wondering if, at some point makes the current Drupal association obsolete, right? Or unnecessary, right? And the way I'm thinking of this is, Nora brought up that EMEA has Drupal associations, right? In the US, we have, fiscal sponsors that are nonprofit orgs that fiscally sponsor all of the camps, right? So I'm wondering, do you see a model where all of those organizations report into the federation? Or do you see a model in the US where all of the fiscal sponsors report into the Drupal Association and then the Drupal Association reports into the federation? And I will say in my first example, it seems like at that point maybe the DA as we know it today isn't necessarily needed and maybe they get absorbed into the federation. I don't know, but like is that something that is kind of in the back of your mind as far as like maybe someday the DA, the US based DA isn't a thing anymore?
Yeah, no, that's don't tell my board, but that's definitely a possibility, right? The current and I would say definitely if this happens, if we're investigating right now, no decisions have been made, but if this fulfills its promise, the current Drupal Association in the US would change dramatically. And the way we're thinking about it right now is that nations would have, there would be a national Drupal that would be a member of this international. And
Mhm.
then under that national association, there might be, in the US, there might be groups that feed into that national association. It would
It
fundamentally change. Now, one of the issues we're addressing though is thinking about, like Europe has lots of nations, and if they each had one Drupal and they got one vote, the US has one nation, and and it had one vote. Is that equitable and fair? Is that the right way to do governance? So that's one of the we have to kind of we're not decided upon that national approach, if you will, as members, but that's kind of our starting point in thinking about it. But there are some things to think about there. So yeah, so the DA would change a lot, and we are in contact with the fiscal agent in the U.S. and with local groups, and we want them to be involved because even if they're not ultimately directly a member of this association, they would be indirectly, and we want them to be involved. And so we're kind of trying to include as many voices as we can in this process, and we recognize that there are things that will change. So one thing for local associations, they have to decide what they're going to get out of it. Like, how is this beneficial to them? And so ultimately, what we need to create is they're going to get something out of it that's helpful to them in their local association, and then they're going to help the international association build, maintain the servers and deliver the programs and do that, and so both parties have to say like this is a good move forward. And the fiscal agency in the U.S., I know there's a not-for-profit that's done a lot of that and addressed that, but in other areas, being a fiscal agent might be an important role that the international DA plays.
and so those kind of I'm trying to think of the word. So those responsibilities that the Drupal Association currently takes would mostly move to the International Federation, like managing the website, managing DrupalCons in Europe, Asia, and US. All that stuff would kind of still stay with the same group of people, but it would just be part of the International Federation now, right?
Yeah, probably yes. Again, nothing's been ultimately decided, but the thinking is responsibility for the servers, the trademark responsibilities that the
Right.
association had, both for Drupal and for DrupalCon, the marketing efforts that we're doing underway to market Drupal, all that would move eventually to the international association, and then, but I think the change part would be, under a federated model, how do the DrupalCons operate in Europe and in North America? And it might be a little bit different than the way it is now. Right now, we're doing it from our current organizational structure and trying to build good relationships. I imagine DrupalCon Europe under a federated model where there's many European countries that are members of this international federation, it would be much more control would be devolved down to the local associations to actually run it. Maybe even a host country, when it's being held in Austria, the Drupal community really takes the lead on running it. It with support of the DA, obviously, in the way we do it, but like they have a lot more ownership and control over it.
Yeah. Kind of feels similar to like, when DrupalCon North America goes into a specific state or region with a Drupal camp, usually a lot of those organizers are involved in organizing. So I'm wondering I'm wondering if you see any downside to creating an international Drupal federation? I know it's super early in
Mhm.
the like discovery process, if you will, but I'm wondering if any downsides have been identified yet.
I mean, no downsides have been really identified, but I think there are some challenges that may turn into downsides. So the flip side of how much of our conversation so far about how involved these local Drupal groups and communities would be means that local Drupal communities and groups need to be involved. And so, one risk is there enough, local organization and local energy, around Drupal and enough communities to really make a federation live into its goals and purposes. We may start with, you know, under the law we're looking at, we could start with as few as 2 or 3 members, but we would not fulfill the promise if we only had we had 2 or 3 Drupal associations running this international not-for-profit. We really need, you know, many groups over it, across the globe to really fulfill the promise. So I do have some concerns there. I know since COVID, some local groups have had a hard time coming back with their local camps, and they've been, and some have come back very strong. And I think we're seeing in the last year and a half, we're seeing a little bit of an uptick in groups coming back, getting activated. But that's, I think, is, under this model right now, if the if the if the servers go down on Drupal.org, it's the DA's responsibility and my 13-member board that 2 are elected and 11 are appointed. If under a federation, the servers go down, then it's the federation staff and board and the members that have this responsibility to kind of figure out, what to do about it. So it will require a strengthening of local Drupal community groups and associations.
So I'm thinking about this project and I'm realizing I wouldn't even know where to begin. Or something like this. What do you see as kind of the biggest challenge or blocker? I mean, is it financial? Is it legal? Is it coordination? Like, what's the biggest challenge to this initiative?
Yeah, Nick, I'm right where you are, and I'm trying to think. There's so many aspects of this problem. Like, I don't know how to begin to, how do you begin to, what's the phrase, eat the elephant or whatever? Like, like it's huge. So I talked about the local association. And we've done a good job getting the word out, and we're getting a lot of responses from people that are, throughout the globe want to participate. So I think we're on the road to like getting enough input. But I think so. The second challenge I see and the second approach is just kind of putting a framework to the approach. The law that we're going under Belgium that we're right now targeted on is called the AISBL law, and I forget what it stands for. It's either French or Flemish, but it's basically built for international not-for-profits, and it's been around for a while. It was intended to be for not-for-profits, so it's pretty light, which is good that it doesn't require a lot of things. It requires there has to be a national assembly of all members have to meet once a year. They can do it virtually, and they have to vote on the budget and vote on the and then they elect a board that then runs the not for profit throughout the year. And then beyond that, you can there's a lot of flexibility in how you structure it. So I think that's the challenge we're having is coming up with a model that will meet the needs of the DA, which is we need a kind of a transparent, super inclusive governance process where everyone who cares about Drupal is involved, but then also at the end of the day delivers the resources necessary to keep all the responsibilities that we have going and to grow those responsibilities. And then the flip side of that is what do local associations need to find a beneficial relationship with this international to become a member. So crafting that kind of it'll come down to basically an agreement. If you become a member, you will get these things and but you also have these responsibilities. And so there's a lot of components to that. And I think the biggest challenge has been just trying to detail what all those questions are. We've asked people and we have a list. We're working on a list of questions now. The working group's coming together this week and we'll begin kind of chopping through that. And I hope over like many things we do, we'll set up a Slack channel for those who are interested in involved. We have a project page set up on Drupal.org already. We'll be building that out. We'll be doing surveys and really targeted to local association leaders to get their involvement. So there's a lot of unknowns, and there are unknown unknowns. But I think that's enormity of all the issues that we have to think about is kind of what I see as the biggest obstacle right now. Like, kind of put some structure on that so we can all be talking about the right things at the right time to figure out the direction we want to go.
It's like instead of a bottom up approach, it's like a top down approach, right? Where like you almost have to create the Drupal Federation and the board, and then in my head, I'm kind of like, all right, there need to be regional, organizations, right? Either North America or US, and then EMEA, and then, APAC, and like, and then they can kind of help to manage the more local, of groups, right, within their, geographic location. But I mean,
Well,
along with all that comes a lot of governance, I would imagine, as to like, okay, what are your membership dues? What are your structures? What are your responsibilities? Like, definitely
yep,
a lot of boxes to check before you just kind of run down the road, right?
right. And what's the right appropriate level of all these things that's where people feel like it's worth it, that they're getting the advantages that they want to get by joining the federation. Part of like what we found is we looked at the data on this. I shared some of the data on the webinars we've done, but just looking last year, we had 7,200 individual contributors to Drupal that made contributions, and 45% of those came out of Europe, and
Wow.
about just over a quarter came from North America. So, that's a huge cohort of folks that are, and how do we actively get them engaged formally into our governance process? Right now, we just try to do a lot of that. We have board members that are European; they represent those voices, but we don't have a formal way. To your point about the different levels we might have, very possible there'll be a couple regional type groups that will help organize activities within a continent or something.
Yeah, makes sense.
Well, maybe just to expand on that a little bit, I think we talked about it already, but I don't know if you can really think structurally, if the current US based DA does in a way move to a national organization, what do you think maybe the structure and or other services besides website things, might look like as an organization?
Yeah, so that's a great question, and I think so. One thing that I think we also uncovered in so far in this process is, and I'm most guilty of it, is that U.S. based not for profit, the DA, has been so focused on building the globe, supporting the global community, that we haven't done some of the things that other nations, Drupal associations do internally for supporting their community. So our connection with local Drupal associations has not been where we want it to be. I have Joy on the team has done a lot, but she's one person, right? And she has global responsibilities to try to build these connections. So where I see things changing in a positive way would be that the U.S. Drupal Association changes a lot. A lot of it would now start to become inward focused to the U.S. or to North America, depending on what the reach is. But it would be, how do we support the local camps? How do we, both in, I think there's a wide range of things that we could be doing, and that would be dependent on what each country needs. But do we host the websites that are controlled by the local groups, but then we can kind of host them on a common platform with common, updated branding? Do we host, do we take off some of the back office work off of local camp organizers? So registrations and do we build the systems and provide the systems to these camps to do that? And then, so we can provide that kind of stuff. I mean, marketing, Drupal camps on, getting new people on. When someone comes in that are a first time contributor to D.org, are we able to connect them to local resource? Hey, you're out of Asheville. You should go to the Asheville Drupal camp, that sort of thing. Like, we don't do that right now. Those are the ways I see certainly the US not for profit changing. But that those would be the same questions that other members of this international association would be asking themselves. What can this international not for profit provide for us in terms of infrastructure and support so that we can do, a better job of focusing on the community that's in our area.
Now it's interesting because I seem to recall a recent conversation with the folks over on the European side, and they brought to my attention that there are some other nation top level domain Drupal domains that exist. And for instance, Drupal.nl. And, so there had been some thought at some point to make more like sort of regional outreach efforts, and brand, not branding, but I would say like organization, around these sort of regions. So, I think it, I don't know if that came up kind of conversation previously at your summits, but it would be interesting to have a world, right, where you'd have a Drupal.us or a Drupal dot whatever other country, sort of version, and it would be not only translated potentially for different languages, but regionally sort of speaking to that group of either users or potential clients or whatever as well. So I almost think of this to some degree as tangentially being a marketing mechanism for Drupal as a whole, as well as being like sort of more cognizant of the localized needs of the market and or the users and developers in that group, right?
Yeah, no, Nora, that's a great point. And that, what you referenced about the Dutch Drupal Association has a really good website, and they've started, I think they've partnered with France and a couple others to try to extend it. And then exactly what you're talking about. They have a good structure. It's updated with our branding, with a new branding. Now, can they do this for France? French can translate it into French, and then you go to Germany and so forth. And then as a marketing, definitely, you can use local brands that are relevant to that community and to those sellers. And then if you're a buyer in the European Union and you're going to the French Drupal Association website and the Dutch and the German, they all look kind of the same. There might be differences, different language, but they all kind of are consistent. And so you feel like you're looking at a single product, which we are, across the globe, and this is exactly what major proprietary brands do, right? They have local, but there's a consistency that's there. So the Dutch are already ahead on that in Europe. And part of this, it was interesting when our board was talking about this in March, Europeans were already talking about how do they organize themselves better at a regional level across Europe on initiatives like this. And so part of what that is also part of what's sparked our thinking about we need to think about this international federation, not just try to solve a narrow problem, but really think about how to get governance, the right governance into the system. But it's exactly examples like that where it would allow us to have Nic's YMCA reference. We could have the branding that's international and the standards that are international, and then but local application. Local decision about when to hold camps, how to hold camps, what's the content, what are the companies to highlight, etc. All that.
So something comes to mind, and I wonder, like, do we risk becoming more isolated in this model, or developing silos of like, hey, Drupal group A is doing their Drupal and national group A is doing this, and Drupal national group B is doing this, and C is doing that, and like, now it's what flavor of Drupal, what national flavor of Drupal are you using, seeing, promoting, so on and so forth.
Yeah. No, that's a good point. That's a risk that hasn't been raised, John. So that's a good. This is the first time I'm hearing that, but that is a good point. And I think we've been so focused on the other side of that, which is people not connected, people not doing things consistent when they could, and sharing information and getting involved in governance. But like right now, when my board says we're going to go in this a certain direction, they vote on, they all agree, then we can all run, like we meaning the DA and all our programs can run all in that same direction. And there's no whether you like it or not, but we're going to be consistent in running in that direction, right? What you bring up is the risk of that, which is under a federated model, the international can do some, but there's going to be more local decision making and control, basically, on some of these things like branding and marketing and so forth that could make it look not as connected or kind of in silos. So, I mean, typically the way these are solved in like the Red Cross example or the YMCA example is that there's an agreement, and so there'll be an agreement between the international and the local, and the local has to look at this agreement and say, yes, we agree to this. And it might have things like you will use the updated brand, like, or whatever. Like, and then there'll be the need to kind of enforce that at certain times. So that will definitely be an aspect of it. But so the flip side is more inclusive governance, but more inclusive governance can lead to more pockets of people doing their own thing and it not always looking as consistent across the world. And that's just kind of the trade off. And where we land on that line, I'm not sure where we'll land, but I do think this is a better model. Like the pros of this model outweigh the cons from what I've seen now so far.
Yeah, and I mean governance goes both ways, right? It's a way to lack of better words control what the lower organizations are doing, but it's also a way to ensure that everybody's kind of moving in the same direction, right? And with their own kind of regional flavor of that. I liken it to Drupal camps, for example, like Norah can speak to this. Like Ned Camp and Mid Camp are two very different camps with their own flavor of doing things. But we have a lot of similar aspects as well. So yeah, I can
Yeah.
definitely see what you're saying with applying that governance layer at a more global level can help kind of bring good ideas and common practices across the community. So I'm sold, Tim. I'm sold on this idea. And I'm wondering how many months, years do you think it's going to take for us to kind of roll this change out or begin to
Yeah.
start seeing, the Drupal Federation, spring into existence?
Yeah, that's a little bit of an unknown question. We've laid out a pretty aggressive schedule to do our evaluation. We want to know by DrupalCon Vienna, is this going to work, and do we have the details worked out? So so the board will meet at DrupalCon Vienna the weekend before, and then at our public meeting, if we're ready, we'll vote to say yes, move forward with this. The application process takes months and all that. If we lived into that time frame, the fastest this would happen would be quarter 1 of 2026, which would be very fast and very aggressive. But there's another layer to this, which is we need at least 3 members or 2 or 3 members to create the organization. But as I said before, we really want to know that there's going to eventually be 10, 12, 14, whatever the right number is across the globe, that this isn't just 3 or 4 strong associations, creating this. And so that will take throughout, let's say if we do launch in Q1 of 2026, then it's throughout 2026 and 2027, getting those other groups to the point where they also become members of the association. So actually launching an international federation could happen in 6 to 8 months. Fulfilling everything we want out of this would be 12 to 24 months, and that's ideal case.
Okay, well, you heard it here first, folks. You can hold Tim to a 12 to 24-month timeline of success here.
This isn't recorded, is it?
No, not at all.
So I mean, that's way more aggressive than I expected. But I guess, but before I ask my next question, I guess one thing that I haven't heard is what's the estimate of the extra? I mean, obviously there's benefits. We've been talking about those, and I think
Mhm.
it sounds like a great thing to explore at least, right? Even if the decision is we shouldn't really do this at this time, it still lays the groundwork for the future. It sounds to me like the biggest point of failure will be if you can't find those 10 to 12 future associations, right? That
Right.
and like I said, that's not the kind of thing that's like, hey, we're not going to do this ever. That sounds more like, hey, we're going to do this later. We just need to develop those more. But what what's the estimated kind of time and money cost? Because splitting the USDA into not the USDA, the Drupal
I said that
Association
many
for the
times.
US and the International Federation into 2 is gonna have some inefficiencies, which is why you kinda need that critical mass for it to make sense. Do you
Right.
have an idea of what that cost is yet or no?
No, we don't have any numbers on paper at all, even in my head. But I would acknowledge, so a couple of things. One, I acknowledge that an international federation will require a lot more facilitating work and communication work than we do now. So there is a little bit just because if you have 10 members and they're all voting members, they have to meet once a year and vote on your budget. That's a lot more facilitation than what we do now, but not huge amount of cost. We don't have what what I see happening in the realistically is we have the Drupal Association in the US operating. We run our servers, we run our programs, we enforce our trademarks. All that's operating now. This international federation will get created, and then there'll be a process of moving assets and people, at least on paper, over to the new association. So in the short run, there'll be an MOU between the International Association, which is governed by its members, and the US, which has 17, 18 team members, all the keys, Tim Lennon, all that, and there'll be an MOU that says, okay, for the next 12 months or whatever time period, the U.S. not-for-profit will provide services to the international not-for-profit. That's in accordance with everything we do today, and that will buy us time to figure out how to move things over legally in the right way.
And an
So
MOU is what, Tim?
memorandum of understanding. Thank you.
No
So
problem.
yeah, no, I've been called on that. So I was on one of my webinars and I said MOU, and they're like, "What is that?" It's so yeah. So there would be basically a legal agreement. So let's say there's a legal entity international. The DA is still a legal agreement. There'll be boards on both, and we don't know what the board will look like over here, but it may be similar board, maybe some of the same board members. Depends how they're elected and identified. And then over 12 months or whatever time period, at launch, the international not-for-profit will contract with the U.S. not-for-profit to provide all the services. And then over time, whatever schedule, it'll move officially under the not-for-profit. And at some point in the future, that MOU, that agreement will go away. And then probably the U.S. not-for-profit will restructure. And back to our previous conversation, kind of think about what its future is in terms of what is the role of the U.S. based not for profit going forward if it's no longer responsible for the servers and for directly interfacing with the project and all that.
So very similar to a spin-off of a company where it's like, hey, for this period of time, you have like shared services or one's providing services to another. One thing that I wonder here is like the national organizations, right? Of the basically the founding members of this, federation, right? If they don't exist, they'll have to be created, right? So like if you wanted to have a EU Drupal Association, right? That doesn't really exist. You'd need to create it. And same thing for, South America or Asia Pacific or, is there any thought or mechanism being discussed about potentially having to do that?
So we haven't gotten to that, but that's been flagged as an issue, but we haven't started mapping out what that would look like. What we have done is we've pulled, as I said, my teammate Joy has spent last year and this year talking to a lot of the groups around the globe, Drupal groups. So we know that we have contacts with folks from all over the world, not just individual contributors, but really camp organizers or event organizers or Drupal community associations. We know which ones right now, or at least we have a running list of which ones are legally organized right now. Like there's a legal identity. So, and there's actually more than I thought. I mean, I don't remember off the top of my head, but there's at least 20 to 30 right now that are legally organized at the local level. And I think, so there's more than I thought. And then we're looking at groups that are maybe active or they meet up or they have a website, but they're not a legal entity. So we will have to, if the decision is that there needs to be a legal entity to be a full member of the association, because maybe you need the ability to have a bank account, or you need to be able to legally enter into an agreement. So if that's where we end up, there have been thoughts that there would be this kind of associate member that's a pathway. So you could become an associate member, get right involved in the governance from day one, and then work towards getting incorporated, whatever's necessary in your country or local area. And then once you do that, you become the full member of the association. That's about as far as we've gotten in terms of thinking about that.
Okay. I mean, that makes sense. And I mean, it's so early, right? There's a lot of stuff to figure out. So I think that's who will have final say in the creation of the International Federation? Is it just the current DA board? Are you going to put it up for the community? Who makes the decision?
Yeah, so legally, they'll be the board. Right? So from a legal perspective, the current Drupal Association board, 12 voting members, will decide, if they decide, they will vote to approve myself to submit an application to create an international, not for profit under this Belgian law. So they will, because the DA owns these assets now, like controls these assets, whatever they are, and the board would be the one, they have the responsibilities for, steering the governance of these assets. So they would be the ones legally to vote for it. But through this process, we want to have, obviously, we're appropriate, we'll be doing as much outreach to local community leaders and camp organizers and we've already sent out one, we had webinars a week and a half ago where we've contacted the people we knew, tried to tell them what we're doing, get them involved. So we do think there will be, engagement with the community, but specifically with the community that are involved in actively running camps and actively running a local association, because they're the ones that have to be able to come to the table. And then lastly, I'll say, while the official decision to apply for an international not-for-profit is based on the board, if we don't have local associations willing to join, we won't apply. So local associations have an ultimate role in this too, in kind of the ultimate decision. Legally, we need to have at least 2, but the board will set a certain number, 3, 5, 10, whatever. We will not submit an application until we have at least X number of associations willing to become inaugural members. And so obviously those folks have a say in it, because if they don't sign up, then we won't be able to move forward.
So just to kind of wrap this up here, I feel like there's lots of next steps. And, I hear that you're asking that, setting expectations that local associations and or local groups likely will need to be involved in some way, shape, or form.
Yes.
Do you anticipate having something similar to what's going on over at the Drupal CMS Marketplace channel, where you're, asking for folks to provide feedback within the community every week, or just generally, where can people best get involved with this initiative?
Yeah, that's a good question, Nora. I think we do want to mirror what's happening in the Drupal CMS Marketplace engagement, which Tiffany Fowley with Palantir has done a tremendous job of getting broad-based input on that initiative, but with a little bit of a twist. And I think the difference is in this initiative, we're looking for local groups to come up with a consensus opinion on ideas, and we'll work through a representative from that group. So the Dutch Drupal Association would kind of poll its members about different topics and then send in a single response. And obviously that's because ultimately we'll need groups, a group to make a decision to join or not to join. And so we'll be working in that way. So we've communicated we have a list of the local leaders we're communicating out. And then in general, we will post on the project page and probably create a Slack channel so people can stay up to date on what's being to participate in the project. We have a working group that's smallish, that's representative of the globe, with board members, 2 people from Europe. We're getting people from Drupal South, India, South America, and Africa, and probably Japan, to kind of represent the globe. And then we have all the association leaders is the larger advisory council that we'll be communicating with. So for the person who may not be affiliated with a local group, try to get connected to a local group, and they should hopefully be your best source of information. Or go to our project page, and if we have a chance, we'll have a sign up for just getting regular updates, either through the Slack channel or through email or something.
I noticed you and several others are on there as maintainers on the project page at the moment. Would you say anyone in particular is going to take point on those communications?
So Imra is the chair of the working group, and so he will likely be the one to kind of take point on kind of formal communications. But we'll be running this at the staff level a lot, so folks will be hearing from me and my associate Joy a lot on this. So I don't want people to flood Imra with questions, but he's like the official chair of that working group, and will be kind of guiding our process on it.
Well, thank you so much for your time with answering these questions. I feel strongly that something like this has been a long time coming. I feel like that there's been good work already done, like we've discussed in other regions. And, it's interesting to kind of hear some of your perspectives around there's a recognition of like breakdown in communication and siloing that's actually happened, with the existing setup. And this is an effort to really bring those, communications or groups back together to communicate more effectively. And I'm really hoping for great success with this for sure. Thank you so much.
Thank you. No, thank you. And thanks for having me on and giving me a chance to kind of, talk about this. I know it can be a little bit of a dry subject when people are talking about governance and organization. It's not as cool as new features and so forth in Drupal. But I do think it will be, if we move down this road, it will be transformational in how the community, we're already governed well and we have governing principles that are strong already in Drupal. And I think this will just take it to the next level and really lock it in for the future. And we'll avoid some, mishaps and governance issues by making this change. So I'm excited about it, but in a slightly nerdy way. So I appreciate the opportunity just to kind of get the word out here.
It'll definitely make Drupal a global entity, and definitely bring Drupal to the masses, I think, as a more global open source project. So yeah, Tim, thank you for joining us, and I look forward to maybe hearing more in 6 months to a year.
I'll keep you posted. Thank you, Nick and John, and Norah.
Do you have questions or feedback? You can reach out to Talking Drupal on social media with the handle Talking Drupal, or by email with show@talkingdrupal.com. You can connect with our hosts and other listeners on the Drupal Slack in the Talking Drupal channel.
You can promote your Drupal community event on Talking Drupal. Learn more at talkingdrupal.com/tdpromo.
And get the Talking Drupal newsletter to learn more about our guest hosts, show news, upcoming shows, and much more. You can sign up for the newsletter at talkingdrupal.com/newsletter.
Thank you, patrons, for supporting Talking Drupal. Your support is greatly appreciated. You can learn more about becoming a patron at talkingdrupal.com and clicking the Become a Patron button in the sidebar. All right, Tim, if folks wanted to get a hold of you and talk more about the Drupal Federation or DA goings-ons, how could they go about doing that?
Probably the simplest way is just to shoot me an email, if people still use email, tim.doyle@association.drupal.org, and I'll respond.
Perfect. And I feel like email is going to be one of those timeless communication methods that people continue to use. So that's a good one. Norah, what about you?
Yeah, you can find me as Technorah, TEKNORAH, on Slack, LinkedIn, Reddit, wherever you hang out. I'm there.
Awesome. And Norah, thank you again for joining us for the last 4 weeks. It has been amazing, and we look forward to having you back soon.
Awesome.
Nic, what about you?
You can find me pretty much everywhere at Nixman, NICXVAN.
And I'm John Picozzi. You can find me personally at picozzi.com, on social media and Drupal.org at John Picozzi. And you can find out about EPAM at epam.com.
If you've enjoyed listening, we've enjoyed talking.
Thanks a lot, everyone.
See you guys next week.